Hello and welcome to the Trail and Adventure Motorbike Podcast with me, Clive Barber, and my good mate, Noel Tom. For the days when you can't ride your bike, there's always the Trail and Adventure Motorbike Podcast. Happy New Year, everybody. Welcome back to the podcast. I hope you all had a much better Christmas and New Year than I did. I spent most of it feeling really shit in bed, apart from the little visit down to London to record the Dakar podcast with Break Magazine and Lel and Simon and Neil, which was a lot of fun. So this first episode of Season 6, we're very, very excited about this one. We recorded this just before Christmas with a gentleman called Mark Wells. He has probably got the best job in the world. He is the Chief of Strategy and Design for Royal Enfield motorcycles, and he does seem to spend a lot of time out there researching riding bikes all over the world. Best job in the world. We talked to Mark for 3 hours. It was a really fascinating conversation. There's some great information in here as to how bikes are designed and how they decide upon which bikes they're actually going to build. And also, we ask the unicorn question: when are we going to get our lightweight, 40 brake horsepower, low service interval unicorn bike that I think most of us would really like, those of us that aren't big bike wankers anyway. We talked for so long, we've had to split this one into 2 episodes. So episode 2 will be coming in your ears next week. Enough of me wittering on. It's good to be back. Catch up with you soon. Let's get on with it.
So the family business, I think they had 15 family businesses, and there were all sorts like cartography and shoemaking and tractors. So Aisha Trucks, Aisha was the biggest part of the business. And Aisha was a German joint venture back in the 50s to bring in tractors. And they then went on to make trucks, and they still make a lot of trucks in India today. And they also signed up a joint venture with Volvo. So all Volvo trucks and buses in India are made by them as well. And they bought Royal Enfield in, as I say, they started buying in 94, I think it was, and took the controlling shareholding in 2001. And at that point, Royal Enfield was worth, I think somebody told me it was like 21 pence a share. And if you'd bought a bullet at the time, it was about $600. Today, I think they're about 350 quid a share, and you would have more than £1 million in your bank if you'd use that $600 to buy Aisha shares. Growth has just been unbelievable.
Who would have made that bet at that point? Old British Mark, they'd all gone out of business.
So Royal Enfield started in about 1850 something as a jobbing engineering business in the Midlands called I think it was like the Gervie Works or Givy Works or something like that. And they made precision engineering things, so things like needles, which led to making bits for carburetors or early carburetors and firing pins for rifles as well. And they made their first bicycle in the late 1800s at the same time as they got a contract to make component parts for rifles for the Lee Enfield company. And so in recognition of that contract, they called their first bicycle the Royal Enfield. And the Royal bit had no Royal Commission or anything. It was just purely somebody in marketing thought it sounded good. And they liked the whole made like a gun thing, and that was where that all came from. And the first motorcycle came in 1901. And so they carried on building in Redditch from 1901 onwards. And we made cars and lawnmowers and all sorts of stuff like the rest of the industry did.
There's never been a Royal Warrant then?
No, nothing at all like that. It's it was just a good bit of Victorian marketing. In between the wars, they were known for V-twins. They used Jap engines, as in JAP, not vaguely racist. And then after the war, obviously their singles became really popular. And I don't know how many people know this, but Royal Enfield invented the articulating swinging arm. Up until that point, you had things like Triumph had a spring wheel where they had like a sort of spring in the rear hub, but most stuff had a hardtail. They had like a secret squirrel department. I think maybe some other people had done it in racing, but they did it on a trials bike that they entered into the Colmore Cup in 48, I think. And that was really super successful. They then went on and did like loads of ISD 6-day trials. Royal Enfield were known for being a trials brand. That was what we did. Johnny Britton and people like that won, countless gold medals in the ISDT. And the Indian Army, so India, this is 48. India's just got independence from us lot, Brit Kick, as we call it. And they were looking for a bike to patrol the borders with Pakistan, because obviously there was a little bit of unpleasantness That's some understatement, straight after independence, and they wanted a bike that they could use in sort of in the lower Himalayas and around there for patrolling wars and disagreements with Pakistan. And because the Bullet was so good at trials, because it had an articulating swinging arm, it had a rear shock system and telescopic forks at the front as well. It was the first 5-speed box. There was quite a few innovations on that bike. The Indian Army bought, I think, 600 at first, and then another 600, and then they said, well, actually, let's set up a manufacturing plant. And so they started sort of almost in kit form, like you get today, like a CKD, the complete knockdown unit. And they shipped them over to India and built them in India. India was kind of socialist, if not almost communist, straight after independence. And you couldn't set up a manufacturing business without a joint venture with that. So they set up with a family called Madras, I think it was Madras Motors, and they had no competition. So they were the only big 4-stroke single in the market at the time. And all the way up to the 80s, they were it. Just had no competition. And then in the 80s, Indira Gandhi, I think it was, opened up the market, allowed the Japanese to come in. And all they did was open up their back catalogue of bikes, Honda CG125 or whatever it would have been, a dream at that time. It was loads better, loads more economical, loads more reliable. And Royal Enfield saw a slow sort of decline in sales. But what Sid saw was that the brand had been so well associated with, during that period, it was owned by the military, so it's still very much, and there's kind of, we often say that in some ways Royal Enfield is, Harley Davidson is America's Royal Enfield, and we say it that way around, but the sort of that slightly verging on a bit jingoistic, nationalistic connection, so it's a very much in India, it's an Indian brand, it's connected with the Indian Army. Whenever you see the displays on Independence Day, like their version of the white helmets, the kind of the pyramids and all that sort of stuff. That's on a Bullet. It's kind of almost a brand like your gran knows it, like Coca-Cola or something. In India, even if you know nothing about motorbikes, you've heard of Royal Enfield. And Sid saw that and recognised that opportunity, saw that potential in 2001. And by that point, it had dropped. I think volumes had got down to about 25,000 a year, something like that. In the UK, obviously, like the rest of the industry, it collapsed. I mean, I don't know if you've ever, there's a brilliant book by a guy called Bert Hopwood called Whatever Happened to the British Motorcycle Industry. Should be taught on every MBA, like how we went from being, it was our second largest export. We were the largest motorcycle industry in the world and disappeared within 15 years. It's incredible, the collapse of the industry. So that happened in the late 60s, early 70s. The guy that ran Royal Enfield during its heyday was a guy called Major Smith, and he died in 65, and it got taken over by, I guess, what today would be like venture capitalists or asset strippers or something. And they turned a factory into a housing estate, moved production into a underground factory that had been set up during the war, where they carried on making Interceptors and GTs, but really in low volumes, like down at sort of 4,000 or 5,000 bikes a year. But in India, they just carried on manufacturing. And so we are today the oldest brand in continuous production. I think Harley was like 1903 or something like that, Triumph or similar, but 1901 was our first bike, and we've never stopped manufacturing motorcycles.
Probably worth mentioning, because this will become relevant later when we kind of look at the new Hemi and things like that, is the actual size of the market in India versus not just the UK, but the whole of Europe. So in India, something like 20 million motorcycles sold.
Yeah, India, a vast market. And we're not even close to being the largest seller in India. We're a niche seller in India. This year's retails in India, so our total, I think, was knocking on the door of 900,000 units this year. And about 100,000 of those were exports. So the remaining 800,000 were India. And as I say, we're comparatively a small brand compared to, in terms of volume, compared to some. We're definitely a premium model in India. We're not purely about transport. We are like motorcycling everywhere else in the world today. Well, not everywhere else, but in many markets in the world. We're a leisure brand as well. We're about going on a bike and going for a ride and being part of a community and all the rest of it.
No, I've worked over there a few times, and I remember taking a photograph in one of the garages, the parking garages where I worked. They had this multi-storey car park literally just full of thousands and thousands of small capacity Heroes and Bajaj and things like that. And there was this one guy that I actually met up with, and he had his KTM, which he was really, really, really delighted with.
I've always seen a huge amount of opportunity with Royal Enfield, and kind of when we started working with them as a consultant back in 2005, I think was the first time I worked with Royal Enfield. Even then, we looked at it and said, there's this opportunity here. Obviously, when you're manufacturing anything, you get huge economies of scale. So a fuel tank costs £300,000 to tool up. So when you create the tooling, you create two bloody great big blocks of metal that you cut as a male and a female, and they crash together against a piece of steel, and that's what creates the pressing of the tank. And a fuel tank is a left pressing, a right pressing, a base, and some tops and bottoms. If it's £300,000 and you're making 300,000 of them, then that's £1 a pop. If it's 300 of them, that's £1,000 a pop. That's obviously how economies of scale work. As a brand, we have the advantage of the scale that we get in India, which means that we can make the same quality of products at a lower price point. And that volume is attracting all sorts of brands from around the world. So you mentioned one there. There are others. They're all trying to get into India. India and Southeast Asia are driving the motorcycle market. Europe, North America, kind of almost backwaters in comparison now. Mm-hmm. And all these brands are trying to break into India, but it's not nearly as easy as people assume. It's taken us years to build up supply chains, market reach and penetration, distribution networks. All of that stuff is not easy to do in markets like India.
Are they as nostalgic about the Enfield as we are here, do you think?
Oh, 100%. Yeah, 100%. Yeah. I mean, because it goes back 3 or 4 generations and they're owned by 3 or 4 generations. And that's exactly where I was going to go with it, actually, was so that you've got all these brands trying to break into India. And they're great brands. There are some cracking brands out there in the world that, old European brands that want to get into India. And they're currently trying to set up joint ventures or have set up joint ventures. You then also have a bunch of brands in India that want to break out that make great product. There are some great manufacturers out there that make good product that do very well. And they're slowly, they are making inroads to some other markets around the world, but their brands aren't known outside of India. What I think we have that is pretty unique is we've got this nostalgic echo that exists globally. So in Europe, we're known of as an old British brand. In North America, we're known of as an old British brand. In other markets, it's seen as an Indian brand, it's seen as a domestic brand. But wherever you go, I think the bottom line is that heritage is authentic, it's real. It's not like you've sort of gone and raided the family photograph album and tried to find some pictures and then done a sort of pastiche or of a sort of an applique version of an old bike and tried to reimagine it. The lineage for the Bullet and Classic is, and the Bullet is 90 years old now, plus 90 years old now, which is the oldest brand in manufacture. And so that's real, that's honest and authentic. And wherever you go, I think that nostalgic echo is really strong. And so what that does is opens up other markets for us. And it means that we can then do things where we look at business cases that are 50% export and 50% domestic. And that makes it viable for us to do stuff that we wouldn't be able to do if we just did it in India. We wouldn't be able to do it if we just did it export. But together, products like the new Himalayan has been a combination of our ability to get volume in India, but also our ability to sell internationally. And that's a really exciting place to be. And I think even now we're still only sort of touching the surface of that. We're only scratching the top of it. There's so much more we could do around that, I think, that makes Royal Enfield just a really exciting brand to work for. And I feel very, very fortunate to be able to work for them as a business.
At that point, we should probably pause. And this is what we do. This always works like this. We always start just chatting with people. We've already recorded 15 minutes without saying who it is, but then we've got
Who is this guy?
I don't know. I thought you invited him. If you could just do a very sort of brief introduction of who you are, talk about who you work for.
I'm Mark Wells. I'm currently head of product strategy and industrial design. My job title is Chief of Design, which I like the acronym because that's COD, which is either COD shit, cash on delivery,
Call of Duty.
Exactly, whichever other one you want on there, really. But fundamentally, my teams look after the voice of the customer. So understanding what is it that a customer wants from a product, trying to get into their heads, trying to eat, sleep, live, drink every part of motorcycling, and trying to capture when we create a new motorcycle, what are the attributes, what are the features that we want that bike to have, and what are the trade-offs, because it's all a huge web of trade-offs. Everybody has access to roughly the same technologies and so it's the where do you prioritize, where do you what things do you make important about a bike when you're designing a new bike. The other half of my team are accountable for the industrial design. So the industrial designer is the non-engineering aspects, the look, the feel, the kind of the persona of the bike. So styling is a big component of that, but not just styling, but quality touch points, all of the things that create a desirability, if you want. And the thing that connects my team together is that kind of design thinking approach. So that iterative approach, that sort of, sketch it, try it, do it again. So I've also got within my team, I've got a small engineering component, a concept engineering component that do some of the very early layout, package layout stuff. I've got a team that do CGI, which is computer generated images. So create visualizations of the bikes in computer software that we use both internally for reviewing design directions, but also for part of our marketing stuff. So some of the images you'll see in press releases and things are actually computer generated. We've got model makers, so we've got clay modelers who physically hand carve clay models. So we might machine something out to start with, but we'll always hand finish it and hand carve it, and then make prototype models, those sorts of things. I've got digital modelers, so people that work in CAS, which is computer aided styling, creating surface models in that software that create visual forms and representations that can then be used to cut physical component parts. And then I've got teams that do color trim and graphics, so decals, the colors, the material finishes, all that sort of stuff on the bike. So that kind of roughly, that encompasses my entire team and what we do.
I know you're a fairly passionate biker as well. Tell us a little bit about your biking history.
I grew up sort of around bikes. My granddad was in the Royal Signals, so the age of 17 or 18, I think, in 41 or 42. He was called up and joined the Royal Signals as a dispatch rider and served with the 8th Army, went all the way through the top of North Africa and then up through Sicily and up into Italy. And he rode motorcycles as well for leisure, so he rode Speedway in the army. I've got a book that I found in the Motorcycle Museum a few years ago called Warzone Speedway, and there's a listing of some of the results in the back, and there's a Wells in there, and we don't know whether it was him or not, but I'd like to think it was.
Let's assume it is.
Used to tell stories of when they were on leave, they would get bits of racing bikes and bring them back in their kit bags and then build them. And there was a similar story in this book. So, maybe there is a connection there. I grew up around bikes. We lived about 8 miles from Brands. As a kid, I would go and watch a lot of classic bike racing with my dad and my uncle and my granddad. Never had bikes as a little kid because I don't think mum and dad could afford them. But so my way of kind of having bikes was to draw them. I'd draw the bikes I couldn't have and I'd sketch them. And we always had Grandad's Veloset, which I've still got. And Grandad would come and we'd try and fire it up, and it would take all day to get the bloody thing running. And so, yeah, so, as I say, I grew up around bikes and always wanted a bike as a little kid. And then I got my first bike was a Kawasaki AR50. Mum and Dad moved. We moved from London up to Norfolk into a little village in the middle of nowhere. And so it was it was one bus a day. And so that wasn't sufficient to get to college and back. So I got a little Kawasaki AR50, and then I got a RD125LC, and then an SR250 and so on. And so, yeah, I've sort of grown up around bikes and just always been massively passionate about them.
I know this isn't about Noel. We've started making some films now, and we did called Bikes in Barns.
Saw a couple of those, yeah.
The Noel's one, and his uncle in the First World War invented the wheelie. We're assuming in the same way that
he was doing wheelies early on. That's probably the best way of putting it.
Have you ever seen Royal Enfield had a sidecar outfit for during World War One? So they made motorcycles for almost all of the combatants in World War One on every side, by the looks of it. But they made one which was an anti-aircraft, where you laid down on the sidecar and then shot the gun up at the sky.
No.
Let's recreate it as soon as possible.
I don't know whether my granddad ever rode a Royal Enfield. I've got a photo of him on a Norton and on a Matchless, but I don't think I don't know. He may well have done, but he passed away when I was only a kid, so when I was a teenager, 13, 14, so I don't know whether, I never asked him.
What was your transition? Because I had a similar kind of evolution into motorcycling, but it took me a long, long time to kind of make the connection between, a bike was just to get out of a rural situation and to have my own transport. It took me like decades.
You still haven't fucking got out of your rural situation. You're still there. What are you on about?
It took me a long time to work out that I could travel on it. And a lot of that was down to good old Austin, but it took ages to sort of make this connection that, oh yeah, I could go somewhere on this. For a long time it was just getting to work.
No, I think I always had this passion for bikes, and I've always said if I wasn't a motorcycle designer, which is really my background, that's what I started doing, I would have been, if I was cleverer, I might have been a motorcycle engineer. If I could do maths, if I was faster, I might have been a motorcycle racer. I almost certainly could have been a motorcycle salesman. I've got the gift of the gab, so I could have done that. And in fact, I did do that for a while. Well, not bikes. I worked in a clothing store up on the Westgate Road in Newcastle upon Tyne when I was at uni, called Custom Lids. And I worked there for 3 years, I think, in the end, doing Saturdays there. And before that, when I was 13, I worked in a little shop in just up the road that did classic bike restorations called TDR, they were called. He had all sorts of cool stuff. He had like an old Triumph Hurricane, 3-cylinder Hurricane, and Manx Nortons and AJS 7Rs. And I actually grew up with classic bikes before modern bikes almost. And then when I started owning my own bikes, as I say, I then got mostly race replicas was my thing to start with as a kid. But as soon as I had a bike, that was my only form of transport. And me and my mates went everywhere on them. We 18, 19, we went on a boys' holiday to Matlock Bath, exotic locations. For me, that's always been the case, really.
Have I ever told you my first moped tour story? The sniffing glue one.
Weirdly, no, this doesn't ring a bell.
I'll save it for another time. It's very funny. But again, it's not about us.
That trip to Matlock Bath, I remember. So my mate Rob smoked quite a lot of weed. We'd taken my mum and dad's cine camera. You know, at the old days, we had a VHS cassette recorder. I'd actually seized my bike the day before we went. I'd been on a track day like a week before, and I dropped it, and something had happened with it wasn't premix. It was two-stroke, but it wasn't premix. It had an oil feed. For whatever reason, it seized, and so I ended up driving a van. We took a van and we put some bikes in the back of the van, and I drove the van. And so we were going along the Cat and Fiddle, and my mate Rob had been filming the night before, and they were smoking, and then we were going on the Cat and Fiddle. So I parked the van up when I was filming them going on the Cat and Fiddle, and as I was walking down the hillside, I stepped in a rabbit hole, twisted my ankle, and threw the camera across the road, and it shattered into 1,000 pieces on the road. And I got home, and I said to Mum and Dad, that was what happened, and they didn't believe a word of it. They were convinced that I'd taped it to the front of the bike, and it had fallen off the bike. And then they worked out that the cassette was still intact, and so they were going to watch it to see what it was. And I was more worried they would see Rob smoking weed than actually what happened.
I love this question. How do you identify as a biker? What are your pronouns? Your biker pronouns?
If you'd asked me that 15, 20 years ago, I would have said I was into sports bikes. That was my background. I think as a designer, you've got to work on lots of different bikes, so you've got to get excited about more, whether it is. And genuinely, I am. I think anything that kind of provides excitement and passion to people is a cool thing to work on. So, you know, we've worked on everything now. Royal Enfield have done adventure bikes, cruisers, small displacement bikes, you know, larger bikes. So for me, I like bikes that are accessible. I like bikes that are rideable. Having said all of that, I've just bought myself a V4 2.0, which is ridiculous. So 170 brake horse that I rode out in the icy roads this morning and just thought, why on earth have I bought this? This is ridiculous. This is not a winter hack at all. I would say, so I don't know what they're, transgender, does that work? I don't know, transmoto?
Transmoto, yeah, I like it. What do you have in the garage at the moment, apart from your Aprilia?
So yeah, I've just bought a V4 2.0. I am notorious for loving motorcycles, but showing them no care or love at all. So I've got a rotting Honda VTR Firestorm, which is a brilliant motorcycle. I keep telling people it needs a wash, but it probably needs more than a wash now. It stood for about 4 years outside, so it definitely needs more than a wash now. I've got a 1958 Velocette Venom Clubman. That was my granddad's.
My dad was a big fan of the Velocette. That was the bike. He had Triumphs and an AJS, and he said the Velocette was always the bike that he wanted.
Do you have that on the road?
Not at the moment, no. It needs some love.
It's lovely to have something that's been around for that long, isn't it?
Well, I mean, I would never get it. It's got so much sentimental value. I would never get rid of it. I've got a 92 NSR MC21 SP 252 stroke, which is a proper race replica made by HRC. They only made 1,500 of them. Little cassette gearbox, 3 bolts, and the whole gearbox comes out.
And is that a pure race, or is that a homologation on the road?
No, that was a homologation special they did for Japanese pro racing. So it was a grey import when I bought it. And when I bought it, it was immaculate, like concourse. The guy trailered it up from Essex. And then I used it for everyday transport. I rode it up and down to Newcastle from Norwich when I was at uni. During winters, I rode it home in snow and rain. That was the bike I crashed on the track day at Snetterton. On the track day at Snetterton. That also needs some love. I rebuilt that from crank up because they've got a labyrinth oil seal on the crank, so you can't, or at the time you couldn't get main bearings for them. You had to buy the whole crank. I managed to import a crank from Magic Racing in Japan in '98, I think, using, do you remember, on digital TV? And I somehow managed to communicate to this guy in Japan and order and buy a crank that was like 600 quid at the time. There was very few of them around. I used to be part of one of these email chat groups that went round. You know, they're very early. They were almost like sort of chain letters that went round for NSR owners. Today, there's loads of websites and information and stuff everywhere. That needs some love. And then I've also got a 2002 Yamaha R1 that is a track bike. That's a full track bike. And again, I've never actually ridden that. So there's a pretty crappy story to that, actually. It was my guy that worked for me and a really good friend, a guy called Paul Ventura. And he was killed in his RC8 going home from work one day, and that was his track bike. And so sort of took it and said, all right, I'll keep it. And I don't know whether his boys will want it one day or not, but I'll not sell it. I'll keep it. But again, that's under a sheet in my garage as well. So my garage is almost like a bit of a graveyard, to be honest. It's not
Sounds like
a good place if you're a motorbike. And then I've also got a Royal Enfield Continental GT in there today, but that's not mine.
So how does it work then with Royal Enfield? Have you got like a fleet of bikes you can jump on one whenever you need to? Need, not want to, obviously.
Yes, we've got a fleet of current production bikes. We've also got lots of prototype bikes that are floating around. I mean, we build quite a lot of prototype bikes that we put mileage on long before production. And so they're constantly coming home. And then also competitor bikes. You know, we'll buy lots of competitor bikes and then ride them a lot as well to understand what's good and what's bad and what we like and what we don't like.
It's hard work, but somebody's got to do it. Thank you for your service, bastard.
Absolutely, yeah. And I mean, and the best bit of my job is actually I get to go around the world and meet people and talk to them about motorbikes. So I clearly love talking about bikes. That for me is the best bit about this job is that I get to travel all over and meet loads of people. And I love the way that it doesn't matter where you go in the world, you come across people, and like we are now, there is that shared interest, and straight away you get on with people, and you kind of, there's no national barriers. A lot of times there's not even a language barrier. Fortunately I'm English, which means that everybody else has bothered to learn my language and I haven't theirs, but the language of motorcycling is kind of universal. I love that about it. I think it's brilliant the way it brings people together. And
on that theme, it's taken us about 6 weeks to actually get this podcast recording together, because you've just been bouncing from one continent to another at various different brilliant looking biking events, and it's like, this isn't work, this is just going to bike events.
I don't know whether everybody's listening to this, but yeah, that's basically my I don't hide it. That's exactly what I tell people all the time. I mean, because genuinely, joking aside, I think if you're going to get and understand what it is people want from the product, if you're going to understand that properly, you have to eat, sleep, live, drink it. It's got to be more than a job. It's got to be life. It's and for me it is. It's not, people talk about having a lifestyle, but it's not a lifestyle. It is life. It's all I know. And as I said before, I couldn't do anything else. If I couldn't draw as a kid, I would have ended up as a motorcycle salesman. So
and I think it's the strategy part of your job that I find really, really interesting, because somebody was talking about, I think I listened to Sid talking about the new He, and I think he said the design started in 2018 or something like that.
For that even.
So that whole predicting where you're going to be in 5 or 6 years' time before you actually hit production, that's incredible.
That project took a little bit longer than it should have done. We had some troubles in development, but also we had COVID come in the middle of it, which clearly slowed everybody down, and some other bits and bobs. So that took longer than we would have liked. We have a product plan that goes up to 2030 at the moment. We're already well past the current He. It takes a long time for that gestation to happen and to finally see it on the road. And the market changes in that time. And so I think for me, there's 3 things that every Royal Enfield has to have. Firstly, there's got to be a reason for doing a Royal Enfield. We should never do a Me Too product. We should never say, well, that's what the market's doing. That's where the sales are. So let's do one of those. Let's do a copy of that. If we do a copy of that, we'll get. It has to have a reason. There has to be a story behind it. Why do we make a classic? Well, because the classic was the kind of reincarnation of the original 1951 G2 Bullet. Why do we make a Bullet? Well, because we've always made a Bullet. Why do we make a GT? Well, because we had a GT Interceptor, blah, blah, blah. Why do we make the Himalayan? Well, because that's how people used our bikes. People would take our Bullets and they would ride them up to the Himalayas. So why not build a bike that has some of the attributes and the characteristics of the original Bullet that people like, that long stroke engine, that tractability, that thump, but make it more suitable for today's riding, in the Himalayas. And that was where the first generation Himalayan came from. And the second generation is obviously an evolution of that, or even a revolution. But there always has to be a story, a reason. And then secondly, it has to be desirable, and it has to be desirable in a way that is not connected to price point, or it's got to be authentic, and you've got to walk in and look at it and go, I bloody love that. That's a beautiful thing. Even if it's not your cup of tea, even if it's not your genre, which is kind of coming back to that whole, being pan moto or trans moto. You've got to look at it and appreciate it for what it is. It has to be drop dead gorgeous. And then 3, and there are lots of bikes that fit those other 2 categories. So there are lots of bikes that have a story, have a reason, and are super desirable. You want them, and you can think of Italian manufacturers that make 1200cc super bikes, or German manufacturers that make 1300cc adventure bikes, big bike wanker bikes and all that good stuff. I've listened. But what you don't get with those is accessibility. And I think that's the third key thing for a Royal Enfield, is that it has to be accessible. And by that, price point is a part of accessibility, really important. Value for money is really important. But also in terms of the bike itself, the approachability of the bike, does it invite you to ride it? Do you look at it and are you terrified of it? Do you think, I'm terrified of dropping this thing, it's 20 grand, or is it got so much power it's going to throw me off it in a second? Is it intimidating? For us, it has to be approachable. It's got to have a neutral handling characteristic that feels good and inviting. It's got to feel like you're comfortable with it straight away. And if you get those three things right, then actually my core belief is that it doesn't matter what the rest of the market's doing. If you focus on the things that matter to people and you listen to what customers say, you'll get it right. And I think that with the new Himalayan, that's absolutely what we did. We went and talked to customers and we understood, hopefully, what they wanted, and we got most of that right, I think.
I've never ridden one. You have, Noel. You really liked it, didn't you?
Yeah, I loved it, yeah. It was the first one.
411 was great, and we loved the 411 because that was designed really for the Indian market first. It just picked up around the world, and it shouldn't have done. On paper, it shouldn't have done. It's 24 brake horse, it's heavy. It had a bunch of characteristics that really worked. It was tractable. So it had that engine with that long stroke, so you try and do a river crossing with it, and it just keeps chugging on through. So I've only come to off-road riding in the last 4 or 5 years. And I'm not very good. On the road, I ride all on the front brake. I never touch the back brake. I still can't quite work out how to get a bike turned off-road. I don't, especially big bikes. I don't understand how you stop them. That doesn't make sense to me.
Make sure you listen to the episode that has actually come out before this one, because it's Lel Pavey, tells you exactly how to do U-turns.
Been and done some stuff with Lal. So Chris Northope Lal's training courses. They've come and done quite a lot of stuff for us as Royal Enfield. They actually helped a little bit with the Himalayan project. They've been involved with that. And, we talk to those sorts of people. We go and have conversations. So Chris in particular has been quite heavily involved in helping us with the new Himalayan and giving us information and feedback and because they see so many people coming through on their schools and they've got tons of information you can glean off them. The Himalayan was kind of almost my access drug. It was the gateway into it because you got on it and thought, actually, I can do this. I can manage this. This is all right. I can do this. And every time you did it, it made you think, yeah, I can do that. And I think that characteristic, so that low seat height for given ground clearance, that was a really important thing that we said we can't lose that on the new bike. We've got to keep that on the new bike. That tractability, that ability to be able to, yes, we wanted more power, but we didn't want to lose the way that you don't have to be that finessed on the throttle that it's going to break away and you're going to lose it straight away, and so some of those characteristics we really wanted to make sure we carried across onto the new bike. That the stood up riding ergs, I think that the Himalayan was always great for that. You stood up, you drop your heels, you bend your back slightly, and your hands are immediately on the right position on the handlebars, and those things we've really tried to make sure we kept for the new bike because I think they were successful. And then addressing some of the pain points that customers have talked about, some of the things that we knew had room for improvement. From a brand point of view, I think I can say now that the front brake on the original 411 wasn't the best. Clearly, 24 brake horsepower isn't a lot. We've doubled that. But what we've done, like if you look at the torque curve, it's almost the same shape, but just double. So you still get 40 brake horse, which is, still not the biggest number in the world, but of that number, you're getting, absolutely, it's plenty. And you're getting something like 90% of the torque at 3,500 RPM. So it's that big sort of flat torque curve. Whereas when you look at all the other competitors in that space, you're having to rev them up to 7,000 RPM to get the same sort of torque. And so again, all of those things were characteristics we wanted to carry across into the new bike.
Is there scope with the new one to put a longer shock in, for example? And I'm 6'2". I could have a much taller bike. I can flat foot it when I sat on it at the NEC show and it was raised a bit above the ground there as well. Would that work, or would that just ruin the way it handles?
If I talk to my chassis dynamics team, they would absolutely tell you that ruin the way it handles. Yes, you could, and I am sure we could do something with more travel, more ground clearance. I mean, it's already got 230 mil ground clearance, and one of the things we worked really hard to do was to increase ground clearance, and that for us was one of the big trade-offs, was getting the seat height to sump height reduced as much as possible. So we did that by taking the airbox, moving that over the top of the engine, which is why the tank has grown on either side, is because effectively we've squeezed everything up, pushed the fuel volume out, and that's made that narrow that way and narrow that way. So actually you stand over, when you look in plan elevation, the width of the bike is really good as well. So the width between your heels and the width of the bike between your legs is nice and narrow. And the stood up riding ergs on it is really good on the new bike. So yes, you could, but like with all of these things, is the bike is designed as a whole system. You change one thing, even if you change the tyres, we will retest that completely. That will go through a whole new testing cycle. There's definitely lots of scope on the platform. And we've got, if you look online, you'll see the spy shots. We've got other things that we're working on using that engine because it's such a great engine. We think there's lots of opportunity to do other product with it. A longer travel suspension bike could well be an option.
Can I give you my list of what I want, please?
Yeah, go for it. Go on.
And then you can tell me about the size of the Indian market compared to the size of the UK trail riding market. I'm happy with the engine. I'm happy with the low service intervals. I want something that's trailable in the UK, so I probably need a bit more ground clearance. And I want something that's about 130 kilograms. And I'm prepared to pay up to £7,000 for it. Why can't I have it? Why haven't KTM ever done it? Why haven't Honda ever done it? Why do we have a 300 CRF and not a 400 CRF?
There's a few things there. I think.
And are you okay answering this question? You don't have to answer it if you don't want to, or just delete it.
Yeah. I think the first thing is there's been, certainly in Western markets, there has been a constant arms race. So when you're in competition, it's very easy to say, how do we make the new bike better? Well, we'll make it 10% faster, 10% quicker. We'll increase the capacity. I think lots of people look at that equation and say, well, increasing the size of the hole, the pot, doesn't add cost. It's not adding material. It's so actually, why don't we make it a 700 rather than a 600? Why don't we go bigger? Why don't we go? And then everything escalates on top of that. And the same with technologies. And how do we make it better? Well, let's add this technology. Let's add that technology. To some extent, that's driven the market, and you look at, even when you think about, so not your spec, but think about a sports bike that's putting out 250 brake horse. You can't ride that without all the electronics on it now. Now, they're fantastic machines. They're awesome. I rode a 1000cc around Alton Park a couple of years back, a 2019 bike when it was new. And it was incredible. You could pull the front brake on and it would do a stoppie for you. You could whack the throttle open, it would do a wheelie for you. Coming out of the second hairpin, I whacked the throttle open. I felt the back end come out. All the lights flickered. It said, no, you're not doing that, you idiot. And I would have come off that bike, I'm sure of it. And do I need that? Is that adding to, I don't know. They're brilliant. And I'm super chuffed they exist. And I love that all of these options are there. But I think in answer to the question of why has nobody focused on the smaller bike stuff is because the numbers aren't there, the margins aren't there, the money's not there, is the thinking. I think it is. And I think, again, what you're going to see is more and more of that. As Southeast Asia in particular drives bike sales globally, you are seeing more and more of that. You're seeing more 400s coming in. You're seeing more 300s. Brands all over the world are now looking at smaller stuff. What a lot of brands are doing today is making toy versions of their bigger bikes, copies of their bigger bikes. This is you look at it and you go, that's a smaller, so 310 version of that 1300. We've tried to not do that at all. We've said, our positioning is make a bike that does what you need it to do. We sat down and said, and I'm really big on this, is not writing down answers, but writing down questions. So what I mean by that is when we write a spec, the process we go through is we'll go and talk to customers and we'll gather a load of research. And then we do a process that we call QFD, which is a kind of a bastardization of a Japanese process, but we sort of took it and then made our own one up around it, but it's roughly the same. But the idea is you take a list of attributes, and those attributes are written in the voice of the customer. You don't say, I want a 320mm brake disc, because unless the customers ask for that because they think that makes it better and they've heard it makes it better and they believe that's the only thing you can have. What they normally say is, I love how that bike stops. That's awesome. I love the feel of that. I like how I can get my feet on the ground with that. So rather than saying, I want a 825 seat height, actually, what I'm saying is I want to be able to flat foot it. That was your words a minute ago.
It sounds like an agile user stories for those of us that work in IT.
Yeah, that's exactly what we're doing. So we're writing down all of these attributes. So, I want to be able to flat foot it. Okay, what does that mean? Because seat height is a bunch of stuff. It's seat foam compliance. It's suspension. So it's suspension. It's, is that one up or is it a static sag? At what point are you talking about? How much sag have you got in it? When you're talking about being able to flat foot it, it's about seat width. Actually, your access to the ground is not just the height of the seat, but the width of the seat. It's about whether you can get your feet on the ground because the foot pegs are in the way or not. All of those things are all part of being able to flat foot it. So when you get to a river crossing and you can't get across because you're rubbish like I am and you've got a paddle, that's important. That's the bit I want to be able to paddle through a river. Right, that's the attribute that we're aiming at. Then what we do is we take a bunch of competitor bikes, and we'll also sometimes build a character bike, which is kind of like a Frankenstein's mule thing that we lob a load of stuff together. And we do that when there isn't a bike in the market that kind of represents where we want to be, or a collection of bikes. And we then look at each of those individual attributes and we score the competitor bikes on those attributes. And we'll then say that's where we want our new bike to be in comparison to those bikes. We don't always have to be best in class either. We may say it for some things, do you know what, it's just good enough as long as we're in line with the majority of stuff. that'll do. On this attribute, we want to be best in class by far. That's the most important. So, it may well be outright power. If you look at the 450 in its category, it's still not a 40 brake horse. I think, as you said before, it's plenty. It does the job. It's still not actually the highest. There's a couple of other, there's a couple of the other bikes that are in the category that are at 42, 43. But we said, well, we need to be in the ballpark. We've got to be competitive. Power figure doesn't matter. What we think matters is torque. Torque is way more important, where it delivers the torque and how it delivers the torque. So we then, as I say, we rate the bikes where we want to be, and we put that attribute. And then what we do is we then put a priority rating to each of those attributes, so that when there's a conflict of interest, because you will get that, you'll get, I want a really slim fuel tank. I want excellent fuel economy. I want X amount of power, and I want to be able to ride for 300 miles on a tank. Well, some of those things are conflicting. Some of those things, one has to offset the other. So then that's the trade-off. And it is this sort of web of trade-offs all the time. Every question is always. So in answer to your question about 130 kilos, yeah, you could do that easily. I mean, if you think back, CCM did their 450 that was all aluminium bonded, and that was 140, I think, kilos with a 450 engine in. That kind of ticks every box you've got, except
price.
Exactly. It adds cost. Yeah. Price, durability, there were all sorts of problems with the electrics on that bike. We bought one and tried it and see what it was like. And absolutely, there is always a trade-off. There's always, and price positioning is a really important one. Really important.
When I used to race bicycles, it was always cheap, light, strong. Pick any two, because that's what you're going to get. You can have it light and you can have it cheap, but it's not going to be strong. Or you can have it strong and light, but it's not going to be cheap.
And it's trying to work out, so how do you prioritise those? And then on that same document, we'll put on an initial hypothesis of how we think we could achieve that and the target for achieving. And we do this, when I say we do this, so this is an event. So we take probably 10 riders from across the company that are kind of proxy customers. So we talk to the customers, we get their verbatims, and we write them down, and then we get everybody to ride the competition. And then so it's not their opinion, but what they're trying to do is assimilate what they've seen the customer asking for and what they've experienced when they've ridden the bike, and then trying to say, okay, so which one of these can I flat foot best? And then from there, that's what I get. And so that's usually a 2 or 3 day event. We'll ride the bikes in appropriate environments. So a lot of the time that will mean, for the 450, for the Himalayan, we did that in India, in Wales. We went to Chris's place and did it in Wales. We rode it on motorways. We rode it on fully off-road. We rode it up in the Himalayas. We'll then sit there till 3 o'clock in the morning debating this. We'll lock a door and say, right, you've had a lovely day riding motorbikes. Now you've got to do the proper work of telling us where this bike should end up. And that becomes the roadmap for the entire project. And then the next part of that, so once we've got that document together, that QFD document, we then create the product concept outline. So that's also includes what is the business case going to be. And you start with a top down and a bottom up. So you say, well, look at the marketplace, look at where everybody else is. What's the price positioning? Where do we want to be? What can our customers afford? So we'll set a price target, and then we'll say, okay, so from that price target, if we whack on, we know what our distribution costs, what our manufacturing costs were. That brings us back down to a price point with a margin that gives us a target BOM cost, a bill of materials cost of this. And then we'll also do it in reverse. So we'll say, okay, well, we build other bikes. We know what it costs. We know what a set of discs cost. So let's put a price against that. We know that bike has those forks. We want it to be better than that. We know it'll be a bit more than that. So let's make an estimate. Let's say it's that plus 10, 15%. That's what the forks will cost. And we then end up with a BOM cost that way as well at the beginning. And so we'll build a business case around that, and we'll say, we'll have to estimate numbers. We'll have to look at, okay, what do we think we're going to sell in each market? What sort of volumes will we do? And we'll do that for a number of ways. We'll look at what sells today, what are the buckets of potential sources for consumers. So when we did the Super Meteor, the 650 Cruiser that we just did, look back at historical figures and we say, well, we've got a bike park of 2 million consumers that bought Thunderbirds 350s and Meteor 350s, that maybe a percentage of those would be able to upgrade. And so we'll say, let's say 5% of them, that gives us that figure. That could be a potential volume for customers. You're hedging your bets with all of it. None of it is guaranteed, but you're trying to build a rational as possible a case for building this product. We'll have sketches showing, what it might look like, where it might go. So the industrial design team will do all the sort of the initial sketch ideation stuff. We'll talk a little bit about how we want it to sell. So we'll actually try and write a press article or a press release for the product as it will be in 5 years' time. What do we hope people will say about it when it makes it to market? And all of that comes together and is then presented to senior management and gets a green light or not. And then we kick off the sort of what we call the MPI process, which is a kind of quite structured process for taking a concept from concept idea through to production. It is about trying to rationalise it down and say, well, what matters? What do customers really care about? I hope that's what we're getting right at the moment.
You clearly are, because I looked at the figures for 2022 in the UK, and I know the UK is probably a really tiny part of your market, but you had 3 of the top 6 selling motorbikes, and I'm excluding the scooters that were in there as well. That's pretty remarkable, isn't it?
I joined Royal Enfield officially as an employee in 2015. So we worked as a consultant from 2005 and joined in 2015. And even when we joined, the numbers were only, it was a couple 100,000 units a year. And at that point, we were still making the UCE engine. And if you'd said at that point that in 5 years' time, you would be in a position where, we would be globally topping sales markets. And also that some of the biggest brands in the world would be coming after us, would be creating copies of our bikes to try and sell. That's mind-blowing. When journalists and consumers do reviews, they're saying, actually, the Royal Enfield's the better bike. And that, that's a huge accolade. And that's a massive team effort. I mean, the investment in people over the last 6-7 years has been huge. The growth in terms of the manpower and the number of people we've got within the business has gone up hugely, and the business has changed quite a bit in that time. I mean, obviously in 2017 we opened the UK Technology Centre, so we've now got about 170 designers and engineers based at Bruntingthorpe, which is just south of Leicester. We've got a little centre down in Spain as well, Idiada, which is one of the great big huge development places. I mean, obviously beauty of Spain is it doesn't rain and get cold. And then we've got a massive, 4 or 5 times the size development centre in Chennai in India. Chennai is the old Madras, which is where the headquarters are. I'm guessing 400 or 500 development staff there now. I think we are world standard now. We are as good as anybody out there in the market today. There's always a sense of massive anticipation, and when you unveil a new motorcycle, I'm always nervous. It's always are people going to like this or not?
Are you looking at pre-order numbers now for the new Himalayan?
We've already started taking orders, so it's already for sale in India.
Do you wake up in the morning and turn on the computer and look at the figures for that?
Although actually the thing that is more telling for me is that I spend hours, too much time reading the social media comments and forums and, all of that stuff.
Did you watch my video with the Lightweight Adventurers? I got interviewed about the new Himalayan. I'd literally just seen it, and all of a sudden, I'm a fucking expert.
You did very well.
Say it with enough confidence. Everyone believes you. That's the trick. As I say, we've definitely got a load of pre-orders, and in India, we've sold thousands already. We sold thousands before we announced the price.
What do you feel the reaction to the price was?
Really positive. We know what the price could be, but the decision on that, which is ultimately taken by our CEO and our owner, is right up to the wire. So we'll build multiple business scenarios. We'll say, well, if we sell this many at that price point, and we'll say this is where the competition of prices, where we think we're priced. We've all ridden this bike now against the competition. I honestly believe, and I'm bound to say this, I know I'm biased, but I genuinely think it's the best biking in its category. And I would even go as far, and this is a properly tall order, but with lots of caveats, I think if you want a bike to go around the world on, which is what it was designed to do, there isn't a better bike on the market today. If you say, well, yeah, but I want a bike that I can go around I want to tour the world on motorways and autobahns, then of course there's going to be a better bike than that. Because if you said the kind of riding you wanted to do was a certain kind of riding, then there will be other bikes that will be better. But I think out of the box, without any modification, at the price point, I don't think there is a better bike that you could use to go around the world on. And actually, the old bike was really good for that. Lots of people have done that. It blows my mind when I look at the coverage that Itchy Boots got with her videos. Yeah. People connected with it because they looked at it and went, going back to that accessibility thing, I could do that too. It's perfect for that. It's a bike that you could spend all day, every day on. And especially now we've addressed some of the things that weren't there before. I genuinely think it's the best bike in the category. And so when you say something like that, we go to market with it and we think that, but you kind of want everybody else to think that as well. So going back to the thing about looking at sales volumes, it's not so much sales volumes, yes, but it's more like I'm looking at all the comments on the internet. And of course, it's the internet. So, there's loads of people going, oh, it's ugly and they've ruined it. But then there's loads more that like it. And that's great,
It must have been overwhelmingly positive, I would imagine.
So far, absolutely. Yeah. It's still a little bit early doors because so customers have started receiving orders. There are customers that have had their first bikes in India now. We've not got any yet reach international markets, so they won't be in Europe until the spring. But yeah, so far, all of the press that have ridden it have been super complimentary.
You mentioned the engine, which you're really happy with, and is it called platforming, where you take components, you use the 650 engines used in your Super Meteor, it's used in your Interceptor, it's used in your Continental GT. Presumably you're going to do a similar sort of thing with the new 450 engine.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously that, going back to the economies of scale thing, it makes sense to do that. In the four-wheel world, a platform is actually the chassis, not the engine. But in the motorcycle world, at Royal Enfield at least, we refer to the engine as the platform because it's the longest lead time, most complicated part to design and develop. And typically because of the way you package a bike around an engine, that's typically the core, the thing that you start with. And so, yeah, absolutely, it makes perfect sense to do that. And as I say, I don't think I'm giving anything away. When you look online, we're obviously working on other stuff with it. But I mean, obviously I can't divulge what, but yeah, absolutely.
Are you able to say how many years this new Himalayan will run for unchanged?
Kind of, and this is a genuine answer. So depending on the market and depending on the product that you're looking at, really can affect the product life cycle. So you have a product life cycle, you plan for start and finish, and you think about how long it's going to exist for. We're already thinking about what the next update will be. I think what's harder to say is, so this obviously is a completely clean sheet of paper. This is a brand new ground up bike. There is zero that carries over other than the ethos, but there's no actual component parts that carry over from the previous bike. I'm not sure how long that will be before we do that again on this bike. But what I do know is that we're already looking at how can we improve what we've got and how can we update that. Right now, and I think I saw this at EICMA this year actually, the industry is in a state of flux and transition. There are some big change drivers in the market today in terms of emissions. Emissions is the number one thing that is driving product changes. So EV is clearly a case of when, not if. But the when is really unknown. And today, EVs are very difficult to make a business case for, especially for bikes that are globetrotters, bike like the Himalayan that you want to go around the world on. And we've started, I guess you might have seen at EICMA, we created our own EV Himalayan to really try and answer that question of what could an EV be like in the future with the Himalayan. And we've been successful in terms of creating a bike that handles and rides very much like the Himalayan. In fact, has some massive advantages. I've ridden that bike off-road a bit and I've ridden it up in the Himalayas, and it's incredible when you stop and it's perfectly silent and you can hear the river running alongside you and the eagles crying out in the sky. And you don't have to worry about what gear you're in. I'm constantly faffing about trying to work out what gear I should be in off-road. Again, on-road, it doesn't bother me, but off-road, and you've got all the torque all the time. And it carries the weight quite low. And you haven't got a fuel tank, so you've got this sort of foam thing that you can hold on with your knees. And
presumably the power delivery is ultimately configurable as well.
Exactly, 100%. You can have as many, you could almost have it on a potentiometer on a dial effectively. But range is clearly an issue at the moment. And more than that, cost, that accessibility cost thing is still some way away. The cost of batteries is just so high at the moment. Certainly for some areas of the industry, that's a long way away. Other areas, I think there's some real immediate potential. I think what you're seeing today across the market is not quite knowing what happens next with that. Everybody, I'm sure, is doing what we're doing, which is we're working on projects for EV and we're working on projects for ICE, and we haven't stopped development on either, and we're developing bikes and new platforms in both. I feel like at EICMA this year there was definitely some kind of almost hesitation. And so in answer to your question about when would you replace the current Himalayan, I don't know. Maybe, if you think of a 5 or 6 year product life cycle is not unusual. It may be by that point that we are looking at potentially EV.
But you don't have a definite plan for that as things stand now?
Not right now, no. I mean, and that's a little bit outside of our timeline that we worked. The other thing that we want to do is gauge, it's only fresh in the market. So we'll spend the next 6-8 months gauging response to it and understanding, where are there criticism, where do people not like it, where are there things that we could improve.
How do you personally feel about EV? Because it's inevitable. It's something we've got to get our heads around. But I'm not looking forward to it. I like internal combustion engines. I
wouldn't say I'm agnostic about it. I see it a bit like when 2-strokes became 4-strokes, or going from a single or a V-twin to a V4 to an inline 4. I just see it as another form of propulsion. Like, what's cool about motorbikes, and you boys will know this, is we went to Bali a few years ago on a business trip and hired scooters and rode up to the volcano.
Yet again, thank you for your service.
Yeah. And I remember at the time saying, I wish we could bottle this. This is what it is. This is the essence of These were cheap little nasty little scooters, but it was the people you were with, the place we were riding through, the fun we were having, the kids we were high-fiving as we were going on the side of the road. That's what it's all about. And I don't actually think the propulsion system changes that. I'm not worried. I think there's loads of great stuff about EVs that people say they don't make a noise. Yeah, they do. They make an awesome noise. They sound like TIE fighters, some of them. For me, that isn't an issue. As I say, there are definitely some big challenges. So we did a trip down to Madrid and we took an EV with us for that trip. We were going to take 2, and then we did some calculations and thought, not sure we'll make it with 2. So we took 1. And we had all sorts of problems with it. It wouldn't charge at some of the charging stations. Some of the charging stations wouldn't work because they needed to send you a OTP text message on your phone, but we didn't have Spanish phones, so that didn't work, and it fell over. And at one point, we got to the point where we got to a charging point quite late at night, and it had been vandalised, and we had no power left on the bike. And we tried towing it with the ICE bikes. That was disastrous. So we sent one of the other chaps off on one of to see if the charging point was working at the next one. And then we started wandering around, and I found a drinks vending machine. And we were like, well, is that stealing? I don't know. Fortunately, it had 2. We didn't have to unplug it. And we plugged it in, and we sat there and waited for 5 hours because of a 3-pin plug. It needed a decent charger. And I think we got to the hotel at like 2 a.m. in the morning. And there's all sorts of bits like that where the infrastructure isn't there yet. It's not ready yet. Price point is clearly, so nobody's making any profit on these things at the moment. Price point is the biggest issue. It's exciting, and as a designer, there's different opportunities, there's different challenges. The biggest issue, I think, is energy density. A litre of fuel has the same energy density as a metre by a metre by a metre box of batteries using today's lithium technology. You have to be careful with that because it's not quite the same conversion rate, because an electric motor is way more efficient at converting that energy than a petrol engine.
I've said this before, don't worry about our listeners, they're all idiots. They won't be able to work it out any more than I could.
When you look at the Teslas or the Rivians, what they're doing is making massive cars and then ramming them full of batteries to try and get the same performance. And for me, I don't really think that's very environmentally astute at all. But that's what's happening. I think with bikes, there's an opportunity if you can keep them little and lightweight, so you don't have to transfer a ton of that energy. You then don't need the infrastructure. You can do it off a 3-pin plug, which you can't do with the car because they're too big and too heavy. But off a motorcycle, if you can keep it under 2 or 3 kilowatt hours, you can plug it into a 3-pin plug and you can get the power. And I think there's tons of opportunity in that space. I think there's lots of things that you can do with it. I think for trail riding, for Motocross is a great example. So we've just purchased a bit of stake in Stark Varg, a motocross company, obviously, and they're building a bike that, in performance terms, is better than the best 450 motocross bike. Now, when you think about it, motocross actually makes a lot of sense because, again, single gear, all the torque all the time, and a known range. I know how many laps I'm going to do. As long as I've got enough energy to complete that many laps. And the biggest issue that most motocross tracks have today is noise. And that's not a problem with an electric bike. So there, you're looking at the benefits, and it's like, yep, actually, that makes more sense. My kids have got a little Osset, and we take it up the local cricket pitch, and we run around, and we don't go across the bit in the middle, but they call that the crease. Yeah. We go around the perimeter. Nobody cares.
Take it up the golf course next week.
Yeah, well,
I'd love to see you go through. I'd love to see somebody go through bunkers and landing on the greens.
I'm sure nobody would bat an eye. If that was a little peanut 50, I reckon people would be complaining and crying left, right, and centre.
If you do it, video it just in case.
I think EV can be really interesting and exciting, but it's definitely got some challenges. Although my job is supposed to be coming up with the best bikes in the world, honestly speaking, it doesn't matter what you're riding. It's who you're riding with and where you're doing it. The best bike ever is the bike you're riding there and then. It's the bike you're on. And that, honestly, I think that's going to be true for EVs as well. We did a thing in Barcelona recently where we were testing various bikes, and we had a whale of a time thrashing these little EV bikes around Barcelona. It was loads of fun.
There we go. That's the end of episode 1. Pretty random place to stop, but it seemed like roughly halfway. Loads more to come from Mark, loads more really interesting stuff about Royal Enfield and lots of other stuff too thrown in. So join us again next week for part 2. Right, see you then. Thanks for listening. We really appreciate your support. Don't forget you can follow us on Facebook and Instagram. And if you really appreciate what we do, you could consider supporting us on Patreon or buy us a coffee. Links are available on our website, which is tampodcast.com, tampodcast.com, where we also have a limited selection of branded stuff. But either way, please Please keep listening and spreading the word. See you next time.